Now, taking a look at one of the top stories today in our country, Canadian lumber is taking another hit from U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war. New tariffs announced last month are now in effect.
The president's new tariffs going into effect today. Lumber, furniture, and other wood products potentially adding more cost to surging home building and renovation projects.
As of today, 12:01 this morning, actually, there is another 10% on top of the 35%, which brings us to 45.14%.
The words came out with the usual confidence. America does not need Canadian lumber. We will make our own, build our own, buy our own. The declaration sounded strong. It played well on camera, and then reality arrived with a force that no speech could deflect. Within weeks of the tariffs taking effect, lumber prices exploded past $650 per thousand board feet. Construction sites across the country ground to a halt as contractors recalculated budgets that no longer made sense. Builders who had planned profitable projects suddenly faced impossible math. The materials they needed to frame houses now cost more than their budgets could absorb. What was sold as economic independence became economic disruption overnight. And the people paying the price were not politicians or trade negotiators sitting in comfortable offices. They were families trying to buy homes they had saved years to afford, workers waiting for construction jobs that never came, communities watching housing developments sit unfinished month after month while weeds grew around abandoned foundations. This is the story of what happens when political confidence collides with supply chain reality. When a country discovers that decades of integration cannot be unwound with a signature and a press conference. When the neighbor you dismissed as unnecessary turns out to be absolutely irreplaceable. The numbers behind American lumber dependence tell a story that no speech could rewrite, no matter how confidently delivered. Canada sends approximately 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber south every year. That volume represents roughly 1/4 of total U.S. demand for housing construction. Every fourth board in an American home likely crossed the border from British Columbia or Alberta before reaching the job site. American sawmills were already running at 95% capacity before the tariffs hit. Aging equipment limited output despite strong demand for more. Worker shortages constrained shifts that managers desperately wanted to extend, even under perfect conditions with unlimited investment and eager labor, lining up at mill gates. Analysts estimated a decade would pass before domestic production could replace Canadian supply. A decade. 10 years of housing shortages spreading across every state. 10 years of inflated prices locking families out of markets they had planned to enter. 10 years of mounting frustration while politicians insisted the plan was working exactly as intended. The construction industry felt the impact immediately and severely. For every 1% increase in lumber costs, home prices rose by approximately $1,000 according to industry estimates. When lumber crossed $765 per thousand board feet, the average new home cost $10,000 more without a single improvement in quality or features. Families paid more for exactly the same house they could have bought cheaper just months earlier. Builders in Texas watched budgets collapse under weight they could not carry, no matter how they adjusted their plans. Contractors in Ohio delayed projects indefinitely while waiting for relief that never arrived. Florida developments that had broken ground months earlier sat frozen as financing evaporated and banks withdrew their support. The housing shortage that had already plagued American cities for years intensified dramatically under new costs. Supply that was already insufficient fell further behind demand that kept growing regardless of prices. Prices that were already stretched climbed beyond reach for millions more families who had done everything right. Banks grew cautious about construction loans when projects faced uncertain cost structures that could change monthly. Developers pulled back from planned communities that no longer penciled out profitably under any reasonable assumptions. The dream of homeownership that had defined American aspiration for generations drifted further from reach with each passing month. Young couples who had saved for years watching every dollar discovered their money no longer stretched far enough. Middle-class families found starter homes priced beyond possibility despite doing everything financial advisors recommended. The ladder that previous generations climbed was being pulled up rung by rung before their eyes. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening north of the border that few in Washington anticipated or prepared for. Canada did not collapse under the pressure of American tariffs as some analysts predicted. It adapted with surprising speed and clarity. It evolved with deliberate purpose that impressed international observers. It transformed a crisis into an opportunity that reshaped its entire economic future. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government moved quickly with clear objectives guiding every decision. Ottawa announced a $500 million initiative to help lumber producers diversify away from American dependence that had lasted generations and created dangerous vulnerability. Another $1.2 billion followed to strengthen competitiveness in global markets and protect against future disruptions regardless of source. British Columbia's forestry minister set an ambitious target that skeptics called unrealistic and critics dismissed as political theater: redirect at least 10% of lumber exports to new international buyers within the near term. The goal was not retaliation against American pressure. The goal was complete reinvention of an entire industry's strategic position in global markets. For decades, roughly 90% of Canadian lumber exports had flowed to a single destination: the United States. That concentration had created vulnerability that the tariffs exposed painfully for everyone watching. Canadian officials understood clearly that returning to that dependence would be foolish regardless of how the current dispute eventually resolved. The diversification campaign began producing results faster than skeptics expected or critics warned was impossible. Shipments started flowing to South Korea in volumes that grew monthly and exceeded projections. Vietnam emerged as a growing buyer eager for reliable supply to feed its construction boom. India expressed interest in long-term supply agreements for its rapidly expanding cities. Australia, the United Kingdom, and markets throughout the Middle East opened conversations that seemed unlikely just years earlier. Japan increased Canadian lumber imports by 26% in early 2024 alone, a remarkable shift in trading patterns. German construction firms signed contracts for sustained supply that would last years and survive political changes. South Korean developers found in Canada a reliable partner unaffected by the volatility plaguing American markets. Each new trade relationship represented more than revenue on quarterly reports. It represented strategic insurance against future American pressure that could arrive without warning. Every shipment to Tokyo or Seoul or Berlin reduced the leverage Washington had once taken for granted as permanent. Port authorities in Vancouver and Prince Rupert invested heavily in modernization that would serve the industry for decades. Loading capacity expanded significantly beyond previous limits. Logistics networks optimized for Pacific and Atlantic shipping routes that had previously received little investment. The infrastructure of independence was being built in real time with real commitment. Canadian mills began moving up the value chain rather than competing solely on volume and price. Rather than exporting raw lumber that others would process for profit, producers shifted toward engineered wood products, premium timber components, and specialized materials commanding higher margins and customer loyalty. Provincial governments poured resources into sustainable forestry certification that international buyers valued highly. Environmental standards that might have seemed like regulatory burden became powerful marketing advantage in markets caring deeply about responsible sourcing. Buyers increasingly valued suppliers demonstrating ethical practices throughout their operations. The transformation extended beyond individual companies or provinces. It reshaped how Canada understood its place in the global economy fundamentally. A country that had defined its trade identity through proximity to America was discovering options previous generations had never seriously explored or imagined possible. Back in the United States, the consequences of tariff policy accumulated week by week without relief or resolution in sight. Housing affordability reached crisis levels in markets that had already struggled for years before tariffs arrived. Construction employment stagnated as projects dried up and new starts declined across every region. The multiplier effects housing typically generated through the economy diminished, as activity slowed across dozens of related industries. Builders who had supported the tariffs expecting domestic mills to expand watched supply chains fracture without replacement, arriving on any reasonable timeline. The promised surge in American lumber production never materialized at scale required to matter. Capacity constraints experts warned about proved stubbornly real despite political wishes otherwise. Worker shortages plaguing the industry for years did not resolve because tariffs made Canadian lumber expensive. Skilled laborers did not suddenly appear because politicians declared independence from foreign supply. Structural challenges facing American forestry remain structural, regardless of trade policy changes or presidential declarations. The frustration spread beyond industry insiders into broader political debate that could no longer be contained. Builders' unions that initially supported protectionist rhetoric began questioning whether the strategy actually served their members. Economists who warned about unintended consequences found their predictions validated in uncomfortable detail. The contrast between the two neighbors became impossible to ignore for anyone watching honestly and without partisan blinders. Canada had turned pressure into progress through strategic adaptation and long-term thinking. Its lumber industry emerged more diversified, more innovative, and less dependent on any single market than at any point in history. International partnerships that began as emergency alternatives developed into strategic relationships with genuine long-term potential and mutual benefit. The United States had turned policy into problem through stubborn resistance to economic reality. Its housing market absorbed costs falling ultimately on families and workers least able to bear them. Its domestic industry failed to expand at the pace promises suggested. Its leverage over Canada diminished with every contract signed overseas. The irony cut deep for those willing to see clearly. Tariffs designed to limit Canadian influence had instead accelerated Canadian independence dramatically. Walls built to protect American industry had trapped it inside constraints of its own making that became harder to escape monthly. Global observers drew conclusions extending far beyond lumber markets. The dispute illustrated how economic interdependence creates mutual exposure that cannot be wished away through political declarations. It demonstrated smaller economies can sometimes adapt more nimbly than larger ones, when disruption demands response. It showed reliability becomes currency when volatility dominates international headlines. Canada's reputation as a dependable supplier grew precisely because American policy had become unpredictable and politicized. International buyers valued stability Ottawa could credibly offer and Washington could no longer guarantee. Trust accumulated through consistent performance while competitors stumbled through turbulence. One decision set off consequences. Neither side fully anticipated when the announcement was made. Markets adjusted faster than policymakers expected. Relationships realigned in directions nobody mapped. The balance that seemed permanent proved surprisingly fragile when actually tested. The question now facing both nations is straightforward but uncomfortable. What comes next? Can integration be rebuilt after trust has fractured so visibly? Will the costs already paid purchase lessons preventing repetition? The answers will emerge through choices not yet made by leaders not yet tested. But evidence accumulated so far suggests clearly that economic leverage flows toward those who adapt rather than those who simply resist and hope circumstances change. Subscribe for continued coverage as this story develops. The consequences are still unfolding across both nations.